The title for Chapter 20 is Girding for War, the North and the South. This begins on page 418 in your textbook, and this is a PowerPoint video supplement for the chapter. Again, the years here are 1861 to 1865, and Abraham Lincoln has just been sworn in as president, and war begins pretty much right after Lincoln is sworn in. As a matter of fact, as we look at the next slide here, just a second, your chapter talks about the girders of the Capitol. The girders of the unfinished Capitol dome loomed nakedly in the background as if to symbolize the imperfect state of the Union. Before the nation was restored and the slaves freed at last, the American people would endure 4 years of anguish and bloodshed, and Lincoln would face the torturous trials of leadership such as been visited upon very few presidents. And so this is an actual picture, a photograph of Lincoln's inaugural address, and you can see that the United States Congress building, the Capitol building, is yet unfinished. As we begin this chapter, again, I wanted to focus on the geography and understand that if you look at the North and the South and the states, if you look at the original compromise, the Missouri compromise of 1820, and how this is the line, the 3630 Mason-Dixon line. Virginia is the only state north of that line, and so then you have these states that Lincoln called border states, the border states of Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland in particular, eventually then West Virginia. These states were key to the North's advantages, both population, also advantages in production and transportation. The Ohio River here was key. If Kentucky would in fact shift and go to the south, this would be a major problem for the North. So if you look here, Lincoln, in order to make sure that Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland did not secede, Lincoln was very careful. He was very political about his approach to the presidency. I think it's valuable for us to make sure that we keep this map in the back of our minds as we pursue the rest of this chapter. Chapter 20 is very keen on focusing on the political aspects of the Civil War. Chapter 21, the next chapter, will get into a lot more details about the actual war. Chapter 20 talks more about the politics of the war. So as Lincoln becomes president, we deal with Fort Sumner. And Fort Sumner in South Carolina is the first fort, the first kind of battle that occurs. Fort Sumner in South Carolina is assaulted by South Carolina troops, but the fort itself is held by the United States Army and a northern general, and so almost immediately South Carolina surrounds Fort Sumner. Lincoln, let's see here. Lincoln, when he becomes president, Lincoln notifies the South that he is going to send an expedition to provide Fort Sumner with medicines and food. And Lincoln fully expects to resolve this Fort Sumner issue, but South Carolina on April 12, 1861 opened fire on the fort. So the fort initially is surrounded, and they're running out of supplies, they're running out of garrisons, they're running out of medicines and food, and so Lincoln tries to reinforce or try to bring in only medicines and provisions, but South Carolina does not even allow that, and they open fire upon the fort. The fort itself surrenders shortly thereafter. So at that point, first shots are fired, and these are some more photographs or illustrations of the battle. Fort Sumner falls, and South Carolina secedes from the Union, and it becomes clear that this is going to turn into more than just a few battles, but actual war. There's a good map on page 420 in your textbook, but again, take a look as we note that you have the red Union states, the border states that did not. These border states of Missouri and Kentucky had slaves, as well as Maryland, Delaware. So these states did have slaves, but they did not secede. And then, of course, you have states that seceded, but not until after Fort Sumner. And then, of course, the initial 7 or so states that seceded immediately upon Lincoln's election. Now, Lincoln is elected in November, but not sworn in until March. And so there's this long period of time where there's a lame duck period where Buchanan is president, but Buchanan doesn't do anything about these seceding states. And so they're given about 4 months to elect a president, to set up a constitution, to run their confederacy, and then also to kind of organize a militia and an army. Since the Civil War, our period between the election and the swearing in, the inauguration of the president, has been dramatically reduced. Now we have the election in November, but the swearing in, the inauguration of the president is in January. And again, here we have the Ohio River that flows on the northern side of Kentucky, and how important that was to Lincoln. These are the electoral votes that existed within these states. Now, in this slide, we want to talk about this political issue that Lincoln was dealing with, and I like the way the textbook talks about the idea of moral suasion and dubious legality, and being very calculating in his political approach to this issue of slavery. So Lincoln, remember, he's very, very keen on keeping these border states, in particular Kentucky. So wary of losing this butternut region of southern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Lincoln insisted repeatedly that even though undercutting his moral high ground, that his paramount purpose was to, I'm going to say, save the Union at all cost. Thus the war began. Let's get rid of that. Thus the war began not as one between slave soil and free soil, but the war was supposed to ultimately be to preserve the Union, save the Union at all costs. So this to explain that a little bit differently, Lincoln never, at the beginning of the war, Lincoln was very, very clear that he was not about abolishing slavery. Lincoln just did not want slavery to spread any further. So Lincoln even at one point described slavery as a cancer, but if you have it surgically removed, the patient might bleed to death. What you want to do is isolate the cancer and keep it from spreading, put it in remission, and then ideally slavery would die a natural death. And so when you go to the map and you look at the Louisiana Purchase and you look at all the future northern states, as those northern states continue to, the northwestern states come into the Union, then Lincoln's idea was that if you don't allow slavery to spread, you just isolate it, surround it, and just put the cancer of slavery into remission, that you can politically, over time, eradicate slavery, abolish slavery. But Lincoln's immediate purpose was to preserve the Union, to save the Union at all costs. Another interesting aspect of this war put brothers against brothers, Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. So you have people in particular in the border states. Senator from Kentucky fathered the abortive Cretan Compromise. He had two sons, and one became general in the Union and the other a general in the Confederate. So the senator had sons on each side. Lincoln himself, Lincoln's wife was Kentucky born and had 4 brothers who fought for the Confederacy. So Lincoln himself, his house was divided. George Armstrong Custer became a very famous general during the Civil War, and eventually then, after the Civil War, famous for fighting against Indians. But George Custer, the youngest general in the Union Army, and this is a picture of a captured Southern soldier, and you can just imagine that the two of them are probably discussing life as they remembered it back in West Point. They were good buddies in college at West Point, and now they're fighting against each other. Lots of stories about good friends, good military friends, even relatives, fighting on opposite sides during the Civil War. Make sure that you're familiar with, during the reading of this chapter, familiar with the balance of forces and also just some of the advantages and disadvantages for both sides. We can kind of highlight some of them. But the South, of course, as fighting a defensive war was an advantage. The North had to invade and conquer, so the South could always pick the ground upon which they wanted to fight. Fighting was always usually fighting on their own soil gave them advantage. They had strong morale. They had the best officers. This is important. In particular, Robert E. Lee, their general, they had the most talent in their leading, in their generals. And then also the Southern man, just in the way in which he grew up in the woods, grew up with a gun, grew up on the trails and hiking and all that stuff. The Southern man was an excellent soldier. And then, of course, some of the disadvantages. They had very few industries, few factories, a lack of transportation. They didn't have the railroad system that the North had, and their population was very small compared to the North. And so, if you look at the North's advantages, 3/4 of the nation's wealth, 3/4 of the railroad, large navy, a population more than double, population of 22 versus 9, and immigration continued to the North, not the South. Some of the disadvantages of the North, they had a system of generals, or a succession of generals that were very, very poor, and Lincoln was constantly trying to find the leader that he could rely on, the general. So on, let's see, most of these advantages, disadvantages, the balance of forces are listed not on page 443, but on page 423 through 425. And then on page 4, we're going to highlight this on page 425. First full paragraph on the right-hand column, it talks about some of the what-ifs, the might-have-beens. Could the South have actually won the war? And if the border states would have seceded, and the border states were Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, if these border states had seceded and gone to the South could have won. Some other could-have-beens. If the uncertain states of the upper Mississippi had turned against the Union, and it was close, but if a wave of northern defeatism had demanded an armistice, And it was very close, especially after Gettysburg, or right before Gettysburg, excuse me. Very, very close that this northern defeatism could have it demanded kind of a ceasefire and armistice. And then this big one we'll talk a little bit more about. But if Britain and France would have broken through the naval blockade and kind of supported the South with trade. So a couple of these what ifs, and you never know, the South maybe could have won this war. Again, a lot of those are listed on page 425. Another big part of the politics of the Civil War had to do with cotton, and your textbook talks about this on page 425 as well. And I wanted to spend a little time on this. The South counted on foreign support to win this war, much like during the Revolutionary War, where the United States hoped that France would come and help us defeat the British. The South also hoped that whether it was the British or the French, the South hoped that foreign support would help them, the South, defeat the North. Now the aristocratic classes of Europe were sympathetic to the South, but the working people of Europe, of course, the working people of Europe supported the North. And because of the kind of delicate situation in Europe, the aristocratic kind of classes of Europe did not want to offend the working people of Europe for fear of a revolution. And so the working people of Europe, of course, sympathized with the slaves and supported the North. Now, cotton becomes important because southern cotton producers felt that the British and their textile industry, the textile companies, were dependent upon southern cotton. However, they were wrong. The reason why they were wrong is that there was a huge surplus of cotton, huge surplus of southern cotton that had been collected in Europe and placed into warehouses. And so there was a couple of years' worth of cotton available to the British textile companies. The other reason why they were wrong is because the British and the French and the other European countries did not have a surplus of grain. And so corn and wheat and other grains produced in the north of the United States, they were actually in higher demand than the cotton that was produced in the South. Therefore, the foreign countries that the South had counted on, the foreign countries were reluctant to help the South because they were afraid that the North then would cut off supplies of wheat or supplies of grain. And so your book kind of talks about how King Corn and King Wheat were actually more powerful than King Cotton. On page 428 in your textbook, the authors kind of focus on Lincoln versus Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was the Confederate president, and some of the struggles that Jefferson Davis was faced with compared with Lincoln. And so this is the fatal weakness of the Confederate government. Pay close attention here to the fact that the Confederate government, much like their approach to King Cotton, harbored a fatal weakness. So the South, in its Southern Constitution, borrowed liberally from that of the Union, but the South's Constitution contained a deadly defect. And this deadly defect was that the South was created by secession. Therefore, the South could not logically deny future secession from its states. Therefore, Jefferson Davis while making his bow to states' rights, had in view a well-knit central government, but determined states' rights supporters fought Jefferson Davis to the end. And this is actually on page 428 and 429. The idea that there's a fatal weakness, there's a logical weakness here, that the Confederate States of America were created by secession, therefore it cannot logically deny future secession. So if Jefferson Davis wants to have a strong central government, he risks offending some of his members, and thus they could secede. And so they are kind of struggling with this. Jefferson Davis has this that he has to struggle with, whereas Lincoln, we'll find out, Lincoln does just the opposite. He has a strong central government, and he then can actually exert more power and more strength to preserve the Union. And in fact, so much so that he goes and violates the Constitution in the name of preserving the Union. And this constitutional issue with Lincoln is described on page 429. 429. But there are at least 3 or 4 examples where Lincoln put in a naval blockade without what is required by the Constitution, congressional approval. Lincoln increased the size of the Army without congressional approval, directed the Secretary of Treasury to release funds without approval, and the big one here is suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And these are clear violations of the Constitution. However, unlike Jefferson Davis, Lincoln could, I guess, arguably justify suspending the Constitution temporarily to preserve the Constitution, whereas Jefferson Davis could not exert extra power because he would risk the possible secession of future states or of existing states. And these are specific examples. Also, these are somewhat questionable acts. He intimidated voters, and he suspended newspapers and their rights to publish certain things, kind of gray areas of violating the Constitution. But those are listed on page 429. Now, one other thing I wanted to point out to you in Chapter 20 is the putting together of the military here. And during the Civil War, 90% of the military, 90% were volunteers. But if you were drafted during the Civil War and you had money, you could actually pay for a substitute, or you could purchase an exemption. And so some of the wealthiest people in our country were eligible to fight during the Civil War, and in fact drafted. People like Carnegie and Rockefeller hired substitutes or purchased exemptions. We also then encounter eventually the enlistment of African Americans in the Northern Army, and there's a couple of great stories about the 54th Massachusetts and other regiments of African Americans and heroic efforts as they fought the South. And then on the next slide, I wanted to talk about women involved in the Civil War as well. Throughout American history, we'll find that there's new opportunities for women almost every time that there is a world conflict or a war. And so whether it's the Civil War and women becoming involved politically or medically or educationally, whether it's World War I and women fighting for the right to vote shortly during and after World War I, World War II, women in the workplace helping to win the war. But these are some of the leading political females, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, Clara Barton, Sally Thompson, and Dorothea Dix. Find some information about these 4 amazing women at the end of your chapter 20. So that pretty much concludes a brief presentation for chapter 20. Again, I want to remind you that all the images within this PowerPoint presentation, this video, all these images are in the public domain. If you have any questions regarding this presentation, please do not hesitate to email or give me a call. But that concludes the presentation for chapter 20.